All right, so I'm James. I am the tech lead at Apollo, and I'm really, really excited to be here with all of you today. This is a really special moment for me and a special kind of conference, because one of my roles at Apollo is to work with teams who are adopting GraphQL and to make sure that not only do they make it into production and everything doesn't melt down and they all get fired, but really that they actually really enjoy it and hopefully get promoted on that kind of work that they've done. So one of my roles is as a customer success engineer, solutions architect, kind of what have you. And I also work on our open source libraries as the tech lead to kind of guide the direction there and help to guide the engine product roadmap to make sure that ultimately what we want to build here is not some far off technical, oh, this is a really cool idea. But we want to bring really practical solutions to your apps, and so you can start building things that your clients need, and as a developer that you really actually enjoy using. So you've made it 3 talks and a coffee break in without any kind of audience interaction. Sorry to say I'm going to ruin that. So if I can get a raise of hands of who's using GraphQL. All right, this is getting better and better each year, which makes my job easier. What about who's using React? Even better. See, look at you. You're already doing a great job. So today's talk is going to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of going from React to GraphQL to production, how it all works together. And then for those of you who are really well versed in this technology, there's going to be some pretty interesting ideas that I'm going to propose and some future work that we're doing that I'm excited to start talking about officially. So we're going to dive in. So I'm going to talk about building applications because that's what I like to do, and I hope that's what you like to do. And if not, you should try our tools. It'll make it more fun. So oddly enough, I want to start talking about HTML first, which may seem like this is a data kind of conference. This is really weird. But I want to talk about building apps really comes down to a couple things, right? You need a user interface so that your users can actually interact with what you're doing. And then you need some kind of data and everything to power it. And so when we talk about building a user interface, we really need to figure out what the right primitive for describing some kind of visual hierarchy looks like. And it turns out that HTML is actually a really great UI primitive. It makes a lot of sense to structurally describe this tree of elements, to be able to look and add attributes to them in a way that makes sense. You can kind of look at it and get a sense of what the interactions would be. There's the idea of the semantic web. But ultimately what this comes down to is this just makes sense to us as people. This makes sense to us as developers of I want to put something in there, and HTML kind of works really well for it. But I think the problem is that when you start to build an app, HTML isn't really designed to build an app. It's designed to display an app. So it's all right, well, I have some UI that looks really great. The design work has been done, but I need to actually make it do something. So you can start messing around with the DOM, and for any of you who really love that, I'm proud of you. But most people don't really love working around the DOM. It's different between browsers. It's kind of tricky to work with. So you start with maybe an abstraction. So you start with something like jQuery. Just I want to make a little bit here animated, sign up form, nothing crazy complex. So the image on the left is just some classic jQuery, which is a weird thing to say that it's classic, but it is. It's good stuff. But then as your app grows, it doesn't really scale very well. It gets hard to manage. You end up with a lot of spaghetti code. If you've ever written your own jQuery framework, it happens to almost all of us. It's fun. Don't do it anymore. So then maybe you graduate something on the right, which is Backbone. And Backbone brought some structure to your applications. It brought some idea of how you model data and put that into your UI. But ultimately, you can see you're still doing some level of jQuery interactions. You're still working with the DOM primitives in a way that you don't really want to do, right? You want to describe your UI, and then you want to put some data to it, and ultimately that's how you want to build your application. So that's one of the reasons why we really love working with React. And ultimately, this is true of other frameworks like Vue or Angular. But we want something that's going to allow us to control that UI that we describe to it in a primitive like HTML. So React is really, really powerful because it brings this idea of, I have some data, and I really would love you to turn that into UI for me. And it's just that. It's a really simple concept. It's this pure function of data into UI. You can call it state, props, whatever you want to. Ultimately, it's content into visual. And so the question here is all right, why is he talking about this? What is this valuable? Well, it turns out you actually need data to put into your UI. And so React really solves a great part of that problem. It solves the right half of this equation, but the left half is still very open. It's still very open-ended. And React solves a lot of things that come along with UI because it's not just about describing your UI. That very quickly kind of fades away into this ideal world where you just give it to your UI some descriptions and it turns into magic. But realize you have to actually control it, right? You have to do things like lifecycle events. So when this input comes on the page and leaves the page, what do I need to do? How do I clean that up? How do I work with those kind of interaction points? As data changes, what does my UI need to update to do? You need some kind of event handlers, and ideally you don't want to build for 30 different browsers. So you need some kind of like unified system that helps you to work in the platform as it exists, that primitive platform, but in a way that your team doesn't have to relearn that for everything that they want to build for, right? You want to learn as few things as possible as a team to be successful, so you can focus on what you need to do, not constantly trying to learn everything to keep up. You need local state management because inputs need to have direct actions back to UI again, so you need some kind of very tight feedback loop. And this isn't meant to be like global state management or anything like that. It's really like the glory of React set state is that it's right there in the component. I have an input element, I type some stuff, and I can render it right back into it, and I can do stuff with it. And really what you're looking for is you never want to sacrifice the power of the underlying primitive. And as soon as you move into a framework world or you build an application where the abstraction has gotten so far away from the underlying primitive, it really locks you into this world where you're no longer actually building the application that you thought, you're building the framework. You're just like trying to work and build this framework, and you get stuck with it. We see this happen quite a lot with a lot of different applications. Once you get used to those base primitives and so you can start to like work with them, a lot of times you'll need really advanced features. And these are situations where not everyone needs every advanced feature. Everyone needs every primitive feature and every base and fundamentals. But ultimately, these advanced features really become the critical things that your company cannot work without. It's not something that every company can't work without, but it's the thing that you really need. And you need someone who's put thoughtful time into making it work. You depend on it. And ultimately, unless your company is trying to build dev tools or frameworks, something like that, you really shouldn't be trying to invent and build these new frameworks. You should rely on time-tested, skilled people who do this work, and again, you should focus back on your product. So with React, a couple of those things is something like an environment-based primitive. And what I mean by this is something like React Native or React UI for terminals or anything that allows you to keep the same mental model your team has and puts you into a new environment. That's a really, really powerful thing. We've seen teams that adopt React Native and React Web be able to kind of scale their platform quite largely because they're not learning multiple languages, but ultimately the real thing is they're not learning multiple paradigms of acting with a primitive, in this case a UI pattern. Things like portals is a really advanced use case where if you have complex user workflows and permissions, you really critically, desperately need those things. But who in here actually uses React portals? That's what I thought. Very few, no one in here. But it's one of those things where it's an advanced feature that it would take you so much work to build and figure out as part of that framework that ultimately you would kind of miss the goal of your product. And then something like server-side rendering. And does anyone in here do server-side rendering with React? And there's a few more people in here. And I really love server-side rendering and recommend it. And it's one of those areas where server-side rendering has come out of the need of actual product developers. Facebook, who builds React, doesn't do server-side rendering. It's something where the framework in the library needs to grow from how the world is using it. The reason this stuff is open source is because if we just needed it for our company, we would keep it just to our company. But ultimately, what we're doing here is we're trying to build something that everyone can use so that they can go back to building their things that hopefully will make the world a better place. So you're here for GraphQL, so why am I talking about React a whole bunch? I promise it's going to make sense. I hope, actually. But so we've kind of talked about the UI side. And we can kind of very comfortably feel we know how React works. We know how we like it. But what do we do on the data side, right? And this isn't something that is really solved in as well as way. We have the Flux architecture, or the Redux architecture, or Vuex, or all these kind of frameworks, or a global singleton, or local state. And the question is always like, all right, what are we going to do? How are we going to make it work? We need some data in here. You may try and make a whole bunch of REST calls, and then your React components that are designed for taking data and turning it into UI become these really complex classes that is about orchestrating getting the data. And now React is being pushed beyond what its goal is, or Vue or anything is its goal, and your Vue layer framework is trying to become your data fetching framework as well. And that's a problem, right? Because you're trying to take a mental model that was designed for converting data into UI, and you're trying to move it into a world where it's also designed to fetch data and manage lifecycles around that. And it gets really complex. It's not designed to do that. And ultimately, teams get really frustrated because you spend so much time writing this orchestration logic and all this complex code when you're like, I just wanted to put some UI. I had this HTML-looking thing called JSX. I just wanted it to be in there. Can you please just make it get in there? And so that's where something like GraphQL comes in. And you're all familiar with GraphQL, so I won't spend a ton of time kind of going over a lot of the benefits, but there's 3 ones that I really want to touch on today. And one is the same way that HTML is a great primitive to describe your UI, GraphQL is a great primitive to describe your data needs. You know, the query language there itself is just like HTML. It's a way to structure the kind of result that you want to get back, and then just trust that that's going to work. Like, you don't really, when you write HTML, you don't have to worry about how it's going to turn up in the DOM. You trust that's going to work. GraphQL is the same kind of thing. You trust that the data is just going to get there. The other really strong benefit of GraphQL is this idea of a centralized schema. So, you talk about schema-driven development. Jake was showing the auto documentation so your team can stay up to date. Schemas provide validation. They provide execution, integration into all these amazing tools. And the schema really is one of the core concepts and values that makes GraphQL really powerful. And on its own, it's a theoretical. Right? I have this strongly typed dictionary of things that I can access, some descriptions about them, and it'll validate. But ultimately, in practice, what does that actually mean for me? And then you have this idea of efficient data fetching. And this video that's going on in the background is actually the GitHub API, the REST GitHub API, bringing back some data about contributors to the Apollo. At this point, it was the Apollo Stack organization, now the Apollo GraphQL one. This is a minute long. I'm not going to hold here, just to scroll through the data, fetching that back. That's a problem. That's a problem for our end users. That's a problem for us to manage. Removing these fields becomes really difficult. I don't know which one's being used because it's all or nothing. And GraphQL brings that way for me to select that down. So now we have this idea of I have a query, and I want to turn it to data. So that's the same kind of base concept that you have with your data into UI. And with GraphQL, it's a query into data. But just like React exists on top of the primitive of HTML, we really need something that helps us to use the primitive of GraphQL in a way that is meaningful for our products. And that's where Apollo comes in. I've been working on Apollo since the beginning, which has been, I actually need to remember the time. It's been a couple years now, which feels weird to say because it still feels like brand new. And we've built this. In my previous company, we built a lot of stuff that we really needed for production stuff. And one of the reasons why I joined was the promise that the team gave me was that I would be able to continue working with people like yourselves to make this stuff actually valuable. I have very little interest, and our team has very little interest in computer science concepts that are really great in the abstract. Our core benefit is trying to make your lives easier and really do kind of amazing things with it. So I get to work with pretty amazing customers. So here's a few features that I want to go over that really make Apollo kind of stand out. So on the left, you have a pretty simple query, and it's bound to a React component. And this looks like such little amount of code, because it is. Like, you're not really doing a lot here. But then, if you kind of unpack it, what's happening here is I'm describing specific data that I want to get back. I'm not asking for any more than I need. I'm actually doing selections on that data with variables. I'm fetching it from some endpoint with some authorization that's happening under the hood so I can get my right data. I'm managing lifecycle, loading, error handling, actually getting data back. Every time this gets remounted, I'm not refetching the query, so I'm managing caching for you. And then if there's any overlap or any other places where maybe these dogs get updated, then I also am going to be able to re-render for you. So in this very small little bit of information, there's a lot that Apollo brings to your app that you don't have to worry about anymore. And again, you're immediately going back to rendering this excellent image of a dog, which really is what we're here to do, right? We just want to put a whole bunch of dogs all over the world, and that's what Apollo is about. Sorry, that's not right. Don't quote me on that. So we want to really be able to get into this pretty quickly. And then you actually need some advanced features. And again, these aren't something that everyone needs, but it turns out that when you need an advanced feature, you really, really need it. And it's advanced because it's really hard to do, and you don't want to spend all of your company's time building it. And we work to do this across the entire stack of the Apollo platform. So for instance, with Apollo Client, you get things like granular control over fetching policies, the ability to refetch, to read from the cache, and to proactively refetch, to do cache-only reads. There's a lot of use cases around here. Customize your store updates, bring in optimistic UI, have live data bindings, so as data gets updated, I re-render, be able to prefetch your data or pull your data, and to be able to do all this no matter where you're actually fetching the data, whether that's the server-side render, client-side render, offline, service worker. You need it to just work from that principle. So at that point, the goal of Apollo is to actually remove you thinking about that data portion at all. And really what we want to do is we want to take your primitive of how you model data, which is a query, and how you display data, which is the UI. And Apollo is here to just make it query to your UI. And that's what we want to have happen. So there's a few patterns and details that Apollo gets. Apollo link as a network or as a data fetching primitive, that really means that GraphQL can work with any data anywhere. That's local state, that's remote data, that's WebSockets for subscriptions or just WebSockets in general. It could be really anything that you want to fetch the data. You can tailor your cache updates, so as you need to do more advanced things, you can give really clear direction. We never want Apollo or anything we do to be these magical black boxes. It's one of the reasons why we're open sourcing a lot of our engine work, because ultimately it's made better by the work we do together. And so Apollo is not there to be the magic data solution. It's there to provide the guardrails and the tools for you to build the app you need with the data that you have. Being able to do things like optimistic updates. And if you have a very active UI, this is really critical because waiting on the round trip will make your app feel sluggish. And then your users really don't have a good experience. And this is one of the cases where when you need it, you absolutely need it, and you need it to be right every time. So Apollo does a lot of work to make optimistic UI really easy. Things like pagination, the web is built on the idea of rendering a whole bunch of list elements. It works pretty well. But it turns out that's actually decently hard to manage on how you fetch those lists, how you insert and update things within that list, how you paginate and continue to add value to those. If you do an update, like you add something to a list on the client, you want to optimistically put that in the list at the right location. There's a lot that goes into pagination. And ultimately, there's no silver bullet, which is why we've built a lot of bronze bullets, if you will. A lot of ways to get really, really close, and you kind of give the final direction there. You want to be able to control when your data gets fetched. You want to be able to prefetch it so your UI is snappy. You want to be able to delay a fetch because something may not be happening at this point, to poll it, to adjust that timing of polling. There's a lot of really complex scenarios here. I remember working with Major League Soccer back when Jake was actually there, and they were running into this issue where they needed to keep a soccer match started. They needed to keep it up to date and live. But they didn't want to always be polling that because, aside from the 90-minute window, there's no chance that data is going to change. It's just going to be static. So how do you actually describe that in a UI pattern, right? With React, I've got the way to describe what the data should look like, but how do I granularly control how that data gets in there? And that's a really complex problem. And so that's where Apollo has the ability to come in and you see the start polling and stop polling. So you can mount it, not have it poll, or you can have a very, very long poll. So it'd say every 5 minutes, check and see if this match is alive. And if it is, then start polling it every 30 seconds. Make this feel like a live thing. Or maybe switch over to a subscription just for this time when the match is live. And as soon as the match is over, which is part of my query, stop polling. I'm done. Don't use up my resources anymore. So the data fetching stuff is all built around real production usage. And it was our working with the Major League Soccer team that built that into the core of how Apollo works. So now everyone else can just use it. When you get into these really complex data scenarios, it also gets really hard very quickly to understand what's happening. So we put a lot of value in building developer tools. This is a GIF of subscription support within the Apollo client dev tools. So as you interact with your UI, you can go in and see how it's going to be updating. There's a Slack competitor called Spectrum that is an open source community. It's built all on Apollo. And they use subscriptions quite heavily. So when we started to get this idea of building it, it came out of conversations in the open source world of, I really don't know necessarily how to model this. The Apollo cache is very complex because it does a lot of heavy lifting for you. I really need to be able to see what's going on. And so we worked with them to build these kind of tools. And now their developers and their team can just start focusing on improving their chat experience and not improving how their data merges together. We work with customers to improve the rigidity and the ability for them to feel confident in their work. Nico, where are you? Hey, it's Nico. So Nico is one of our customers, and I've had the pleasure of working with him for a few months now in their adoption of GraphQL. And when we rebuilt React Apollo for the 2.0 and the idea of query components, Nico is a heavily and pretty advanced user of TypeScript, and we really wanted to make sure that worked well. And so they got early access to what our projects would look like in that and start trying in their code base. We had a really tight feedback loop, so they got early open source direction. They helped to guide what that experience would look like. And it was like, hey, this is really great, but when you make this field required, now we're going to have to go back and change all these components. So it would be ideal if this was actually nullable, if that made sense. It's like, you know what? That actually does make sense. That is a way that this thing can really work out. So let me adjust what this thing is going to ship at to make sure that you're able to keep using this feature really effectively. And it's honestly is a pretty good joy of mine to be able to do those kind of interactions all the time. One, because I like working with people. I'm a remote employee, so my interaction level with people is lower than a lot of my colleagues. So being able to work with those kind of people is a really exciting part of my job. And then the server-side rendering. And again, this is kind of one of my sweet spots, one of the things that I really love talking about, probably to the extent that no one else wants to hear about anymore. But it turns out that server-side rendering is a really hard thing to do. But it's also one of those things where if you need it, you need it. We work with New York Times and with CNBC, and these are media companies. And if they don't have server render content, there's no way that they're going to stay competitive in the marketplace. There's no way that search engines are going to be able to work effectively, and the users are going to be able to get that right experience, nor are they just going to get the performance that they need. And so these are teams that are using React, and it's like, how do I actually get that data in there? And so React Apollo is the primary and most used way, even if you're not using GraphQL actually, to get async server-side rendering done with React currently. And it's because of the needs of the people we work with, because of the needs of the community that we've built this, we've iterated on it, we've improved it, and are continuing to work on that. Because if you need it, you really need it, and it's not an easy problem to solve. So Apollo is ready for today. Hopefully you're using it. If you're not, I hope that you're going to leave this talk wanting to use it even faster than you previously were. But there are hundreds of teams using this stuff in production. It works really well. We're at a point now where I can confidently say without reservations, you should adopt this stuff. It's going to make your life easier. It's going to make your apps faster and your development experience better. And we are continually pushing that forward. But what does pushing it forward actually look like? Matt and Jake talked a little bit about this earlier this morning, but I want to kind of take a different scope and talk a little bit of some differently focused features here. So one is full stack errors, like Matt and Jake mentioned a little bit earlier, but what does it actually look like? GraphQL is that primitive where it's super open-ended about errors that has a lot of things of errors as data as a pattern, and what does that even mean? That sounds really weird. It's an error, that's a problem. Is it data? You can return back data and errors together. You can have network errors along that. There's a lot of complexity that goes into that. And Apollo Client does a good job of just exposing what those errors could be, but right now, it leaves it all up to you to handle. And I'm really excited about Apollo Server 2.0 and future work that's coming to Apollo Client that will allow all of that to work out of the box. So what does that actually look like? So let's say that you need to prevent a user from seeing something, so you need to throw an authorization error. Well, you'll actually be able to import authorization error from Apollo Server, throw it within your resolver, and then your auth link that you implement on the client can intercept that error, can reauthorize, maybe you just had a token expire, and if not, then it can bubble up that error all the way to the UI. So you can intercept that from ever having to manage that in your UI layer, so the data that comes back to your UI is the right thing. Another thing that happens pretty often is you have these kind of intermittent transient errors, like for some reason the database couldn't connect that time. It happens next time, I promise it's probably going to work. Well, that's actually pretty hard to implement in a lot of ways full stack. But with Apollo, you'll be able to throw a transient error, and then Apollo link on the client is going to see that and say, let me try it again, and let me try it again, and let me actually kind of ease back and prevent like a thundering herd problem from happening. And this kind of work has come, it's currently called the retry link, and it's come from actual customers who have like retried and thundered herd and killed their GraphQL server. And so we've worked with them to actually build the right way to solve that. Let your data guide your schema. This is one of the things that I'm most excited about. I've wanted this for so long as a developer, and we finally have the tools to build it. So they kind of showed it earlier of the schema diffing and the GitHub integration, but really the idea here is that we want to put the work around what does your data look like off of your plate. You really shouldn't have to worry about that. As a client team, you should focus on building your product, and as a data team, you should work on providing your data. And there's this constant need for communication and sync and potential problems where communication gets out of sync. Ultimately here, we're all people. Communicating is a hard thing to do. So any chance that we can automate something that's important, we should automate it. And so with our new tooling, you can automate that. You can bring the conversation together in a way that feels safe, that feels it feels natural to how you would want to evolve things. So being able to have schema diffing, to be able to look at what's being used to effectively do that is a really powerful tool. There's full stack caching. Caching is, one of the two hard problems, and it is a hard problem. There's a reason why it is, and getting that right across the stack is really, really difficult. Apollo Client has a client cache. You can actually put that into an offline state as well. So when you talk about caching, you're going anything from the last time a user interacted with my app, so I have offline data, to their current client session, to the server render that just happened, to my CDN level, to my server level, and then to my data level. And there's a lot of caching needs throughout all of that. And anytime you introduce any caching layer, you add a layer of complexity. I mean, we all know this. Caching is great, but it makes things harder. But it turns out that if you have a decent position in the stack where you're in between the data source and the UI, you can really do a lot to make that cross-stack caching a lot more powerful. If you can describe in your schema what the cache relationships look like, then you can extend that, and maybe you want to do a server-side like HTML partial from when you were server rendering based off of that cache. Maybe you want to take it to the client. Maybe when you do a mutation, part of that response comes back and says, I really need you to update all of this. And then you want to do it at the CDN level. Matt showed Apollo server running in the CDN. That's going to push your caching all around the world, which means you need to effectively control it all around the world. And that's a lot of stuff that we're actively working on. Then there's the idea of how do I actually load all this data in? And if you ever have built an app where you've done a lot of co-located data, you're going to end up with 7 to 10 spinners on a page or a whole bunch of skeleton UI. And that's just not a great experience. It doesn't feel native because native doesn't have that much of a problem because it has the built-in UI primitives to make that work. And luckily, the hard work that Facebook has been doing to make something like React Suspense possible, where you can not have to worry about managing those loading states, is going to be a really valuable thing. But you still need the data to get into those loading states. And Apollo was and is the first data layer ready for React Suspense. And I know that because I stayed up all night during Dan's talk to make sure that it was shipped by the time Dan finished his talk, because I wanted it to be ready because I wanted to use it. And so I'm eagerly staying up. It's like I'm on the East Coast, so it's not quite as bad because he was in somewhere in Iceland. Thank you. So I've got coffee and I'm writing suspense code. And it turns out that the work that Apollo Client already does on the cache layer means that the addition that we needed to make to be ready for this was one line of code. If you look at the diff, it's a one-line change to be ready for React Suspense because we've been dealing with data loading problems for a long, long time. And it's something that we've been ready to do, but we haven't had the UI layer to work with it, and now we do. And it's really, really exciting. And then there's one that I am so excited about. And it's the idea of proper async server-side rendering. Right now, the way Apollo Client does server-side rendering with React is it does a 2-pass render. We fetch all the data in the tree in a single pass, and then we turn it into a string. This works really well. It's used in production, but it's not as efficient as it could be. It's harder to manage errors because you're doing multiple passive errors. You need to be able to pick that up on the client, and that's a really hard thing to do. And then you want to be able to cache it effectively. And I'm really excited about new designs that we're starting to build out for proper async support here, where you can start to render your data in your tree, turn it into real markup. When you hit a point that is taking too long, using something like React Suspense, or by using GraphQL features such as the defer directive, you can essentially say, this little bit, send it to the client. Go ahead and give it to them. Let's stream it to the client, chunk that first bit over, let them start fetching more resources while I get the rest of the data. And with this, you can turn your app into a really powerful, performant way for users to access your code, to access your product, and you don't have to worry about this. You just write a query. Whether it's on the server, on the client, you're focused on query into UI. Once you really get into this idea of Apollo managing your data, you start using it and you see all these primitives, it gets really addictive and you don't really want to stop using it. So how do you make that the single source of truth? We really recommend that React is the single source of truth for your UI model, or whatever view layer you like. We really like React. It works really well with this principle. So React is for UI, but what do you use for data? And that's where, we obviously, but I can honestly say that I promote using Apollo for data because it's been worked to make it really easy and really powerful to use. So then you need to be able to use it for all of your data. It would be really awful if 90% of your UI was in React, but that critical 10% was in Backbone. Like, it would stink to onboard team members, it would stink to share code, it just really wouldn't be this mental model that you would want to follow, right? Turns out the same is true for data. You don't want to have 90% of your code be GraphQL, and then have 10% of it with action creators and dispatches and reducers and all this complex plumbing just to do very small operations. Ultimately, you want to keep that same mental model and all the tools that you really know how to work with. And that's why things like Apollo Link State and local data are really part of our critical core roadmap. We're working with really exciting partners here. Luckily, the amazing people at Airbnb. We're super excited about that kind of partnership to make this something that really is about just building apps and not having to worry about where that data comes from. So the world that I hope that we're able to live in, and that I hope that you enjoy, and that I get to work with you enjoying and making it better for you, is a world where you have Apollo and something like React, and that's how you build your product, and you're really focused just on actually building your product. Thank you so much. I'm James. You can follow me at jbaxley III, because I'm the third, on pretty much anywhere, or you can come find me later. Thank you.